Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this book event for platforms. I have it right here actually, Platforms and Cultural Production, which was published by Polity this year. This year, right? I feel like I got it last year.
It was last year, but I think they dated it to this year.
Okay, well, there you go. This year / last year. As I said a minute ago, a lot of people have booked to come to this event, and we're really happy about that. And I am particularly happy to welcome our authors today, because this book is basically become the backbone of my thesis because my PhD is about the platformization of cultural production. So it's really nice, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say, and also to ask some questions which may make their way into my PhD in the end. My name's Zoe Glatt. For people who don't already know me, I'm a PhD researcher in the Department of Media and Communications at the LSE, and Branwen Spector is over there for me. She's my co-founder of the Digital Ethnography Collective. We've been going for a couple of years now, 3 years, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years now. That's crazy. Yeah, and my other colleague here is Ludmila Lupinacci, who's over there for me. She's going to be moderating the Q&A today. I'm going to introduce all the speakers in a minute, but I should probably just at least introduce their names. We have Brooke Erin Duffy, give a wave, Brooke Erin Duffy, Thomas Poell and David Nieborg. Cool. So I'll introduce them in a minute, but let me just say a couple of things about the structure of this event first. So in a minute, they're going to present about the book for about 45 minutes. And after that, I'm going to be asking the first couple of questions, and then we're going to open up to an audience Q&A. We have 2 hours allotted for the whole event, but we could finish earlier depending on how many questions we get. I'm guessing we'll probably go for the full 2 hours because so many people are here, but it depends how questiony you're feeling today. You can ask a question either in person, in person, or via the text function. If you want to ask a question, you can do the little hand up button whenever during the presentation or Q&A. And you can just type the question in the text whenever you want, and Ludmila will be alternating between the two when she's moderating the Q&A afterwards. We really like our events to feel conversational and communal, so we invite you to keep your camera on, but of course you're welcome to turn them off if you would prefer. Please do keep your mic muted though, unless you're speaking, just to avoid any background noise. Last thing, we are recording the event and it will go up on our YouTube channel. I hope you're okay with that. We've found that a lot of people want to come to our events but can't make the times work, and then they really like watching them back afterwards. So we tend to put them on YouTube. Okay, so bios. So we've got Brooke Erin Duffy. She's an associate professor at Cornell University, where she holds appointments in the Department of Communication and the Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies program. Her specific interests include digital and social media industries, gender identity and inequality, and the impact of new technologies on creative work and labor. She's the author of 2 monographs on gender and cultural production, including Not Getting Paid to Do What You Love, Gender, Social Media and Aspirational Work, which is from Yale University Press, which Wired ranked as one of the top tech books of 2017. Thomas Poell is Professor of Data, Culture and Institutions at the University of Amsterdam and Director of the Research Priority Area on Global Digital Cultures. His research is focused on the societal consequences of the rise of digital platforms. He has published widely on social media and popular protest around the globe, as well as on the role of these media in the development of new forms of journalism. He's the author of 3 books, including The Platform Society, Public Values in a Connected World from Oxford University Press, 2018. And David Nieborg is an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Toronto. He holds a PhD from the University of Amsterdam and held visiting and fellowship appointments with MIT, QUT, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's published widely on the game industry, app and platform economics, and game journalism in academic outlets such as New Media and Society, Social Media and Society, and Media, Culture and Society. That made me laugh when I read that, because it just made me realize how many of these journals have like the same name. Anyway, Ludmila Lupinacci over there is who's moderating, is a doctoral researcher in my department, the Department of Media and Communications at the LSE. She's interested in topics such as technology in society, digital communication and internet studies, and critical approaches to social media and everyday life. She literally just submitted her PhD last week. Was it last week? Yeah, which is amazing. And makes me feel sad. But her PhD project, entitled Live Here and Now, Experiences of Immediate Connection Through Habitual Social Media, comprehends the examination of the new dimensions and attributes of liveness in the current social media environment. So thank you all for being here. And I welcome the authors to start whenever they're ready.
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, of course, we would like to thank you for organizing all of this. So this is great. So thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Ludmila, for moderating this, and Brandon for having us over. So it's very exciting. We're happy to talk about our book, and it's great to see so many people. So I see 107 participants. We're going to talk in the next 40 minutes or so, give you a couple of stories from the book, central concepts, and well, obviously the conclusions we've drawn from our research. But after that, we really, really look forward to your questions. So please ask anything. We're happy to respond, and we're just really interested to hear your thoughts on what we're bringing to the table. So I'm now going to share my presentation, and then let's see, here we are, and then I need to put it on the presentation modes. Okay, can you all see it? Yeah, perfect. Okay, so the way we'll do it is I'm pressing the next slide. But all three of us will be presenting, so you'll hear slide from time to time. But I'll first hand over to David.
Yeah, good morning from Toronto. Thanks for having us, and excited to be here. As you can see here, you can download the PDF. I'll paste it in the chat right now. So it's a link to the PDF. You can download it and you can browse along, etc., etc. I'm gonna, so this will stay in the chat, that link. I'll start the story as one of the first stories in the book with this dude from San Francisco. His name is Mark Pincus. He is a serial entrepreneur, and he was looking for a new adventure, a new company. He was interested in games. He was looking around for a new platform to publish on, together with his dog. And his dog is named Zynga, spoiler alert. So Mark was looking for a new platform to publish on. The Nintendo Wii was out. This is 2007. Very popular at the time, you may remember. PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, PC, of course. But something else was happening, and he was in San Francisco and saw it happening. Slide. So what happened here is that Facebook was just about to emerge. At the time, it was relatively a small social network, millions, tens of millions of users, but it started to grow, and it started to grow really fast. And then in 2007, exactly at the same time as Mark Pincus was considering to do something with games, as you know how these people speak. I'm going to do something in the game space. Mark Zuckerberg came along. Slide. So we are familiar with Zuckerberg's story. He never finished his Harvard degree. I like to point that out to my students. He dropped out hard. He started this new social network company. Great. And he made a monumental decision at the time in 2007 to open up his platform for outside businesses. This is a story from CNN at the time by David Kirkpatrick, who wrote the famous book on which the movie is based, The Social Network. A platform for new businesses. Slide. And very quickly, it took off, and we're all very familiar with this. And this was for Mark Pincus sort of this light bulb moment that's like, hey, we should do something here. And they published their very first game on Facebook. It was a poker game, and it did relatively well. Slide. But then what really happened and sort of imploded was in 2009, Facebook started to grow, and Zynga published this game on Facebook called Farmville. And you're probably all very familiar with it. You may have played it. So what the innovation is here is that, sure, Pincus could have gone to the Wii and the PlayStation, but those platforms, those game platforms, are not really accessible. They require a lot of upfront investments, etc. And the innovation of Farmville is that it's tied to Facebook. You can access Facebook for free, which today is very obvious. But at the time, there were not that many free games. Free-to-play games on mobile didn't really exist. So they published at exactly the right time, they published this Farmville game, and they really tied their business model. Zynga tied their business model to Facebook's business model, which was a free-to-play freemium game. So Farmville took off. Slide. And the second major innovation here was, and we're all probably familiar with this as well, why was Farmville so successful? It was an interesting game. It was not too complicated. You know, you got a purple tractor, you did some cabbage stuff. It was, you know, whoop-de-doo. But what was really smart by Pincus is that they really integrated their game features with Facebook's connectivity features. So there was deep infrastructural integration. And we've probably all seen this if you were on Facebook at the time. You could post on your wall, at the time your wall, and later the newsfeed, these requests for, I don't know, berries or ducks or whatever. And this worked as a very effective marketing machine. So what we see here is business model alignment, infrastructural integration. But then what happened, boom, in the next slide, is that Zuckerberg got sort of like, hey, whoa, Facebook users got annoyed because if you're not playing Farmville, you're like, you know, sort off with your stupid berry tractor messages. So Zuckerberg said, it's complicated, it's over, no mas, no more of those wall posts. And they sort of severed the ties. And in the next slide, we see what happened. Boom. The growth of Farmville cratered, and Zynga, as a result, we see that in the next slide. They did an IPO, so they did really well. You know, they started in 2007, and they made $1 billion company on the backs of Facebook. So all of that is very impressive. Mark Pincus is still a very wealthy billionaire. But when Facebook made that monumental decision of cutting the ties with Zynga's and sort of cut those connectivity features, the stock price cratered, and it took like more than a decade to recover, and recently they have been acquired by another publisher. So slide, what's the moral of this story? It's one of the stories we start the book with. Is there's an interesting institutional dynamic here that plays around these three axes, the three mechanisms. We see that Zynga aligned its business model, so it's a market economic business model question. Second, we see deep infrastructural integration on the part of Zynga with Facebook. And third, we see such a key example of a platform making a governance decision that deeply impacts the economics of this company. So I'm going to pass the baton to Brooke, who's going to talk about Emma.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for being here today. I'm joining you from Central New York. And I'm going to start the story with another individual, much like David did, in this case, Emma Chamberlain. If you're not familiar, she was called in 2019 the most important YouTuber today, and she's also known as kind of YouTube's it girl, quote unquote. And in the past 2 years, even since this quote came out, her star power has ascended. I read that she makes about $100,000 a month, and she has about 11 million YouTube followers. And Chamberlain has this kind of rags to riches story where she started, not in her parents' basement, but she started posting these YouTube clips when she was a teen, and she ended up dropping out of high school to devote more time to this. And she relocated in California so she could be kind of closer to the industrial complex there. And she's known for this sort of gritty style that's almost jarring and really defies a lot of the conventions of traditional media industries. That said, she's still made inroads into traditional media industries. Just in the past few weeks, she's been featured in, I think, Vogue, Vanity Fair, and she did a collaboration with Harper's Bazaar. Slide. And so in this sense, Chamberlain is one of the beneficiaries of what has in recent months really kind of taken off as the creator economy. And in that sense, she has drawn upon platforms, creator-centric platforms, to generate an audience, to build her revenue, and to become the kind of voguish term, an entrepreneur. And platform companies, for their part, they really circulate this narrative of generating an audience and potentially becoming widely successful. So in case you are not aware, Facebook, now Meta, is trying to attract creators. And in their public statement that they released a few months ago, they have this call to let your imagination connect you to new audiences. And so it's this very upbeat narrative of using social media to pursue wild markers of success. Slide. That said, Chamberlain in particular has been very vocal about the fact that this is not just about pluck and luck. It takes a lot of labor. And this is a quote that she did in an interview a few years ago. She said, I've cried multiple times after posting a video. So much work goes into each one that I don't know how I'm still alive. And more recently, she's actually taken a break from YouTube, which Zoe and I have communicated about on Twitter is really hard for content creators to do, to kind of abandon your audience temporarily. But she's spoken out against the burnout, and you can see this article here that this content creation profession entails. Next slide. Something else that's remarkable about Chamberlain is she's really criticized the algorithm, which a lot of content creators do privately, but she's done this in a public sense. So she recently left or joined TikTok for a few weeks, generated this massive audience, 10 million followers, and then with a click of a button, which she broadcast, deleted her entire account. And when a reporter asked her if she was concerned about being banned, and a lot of creators fear that they're going to lose access to their audiences and their sponsors when the algorithm comes in and punishes them, she said she's no longer fearful of the algorithm because she knows her audience will just follow her to the next platform. Slide. So what can we take away from this example? Well, the first thing is that Chamberlain is the exception, not the rule. There are legions of content creators who hope to find success in the social media economy by using platforms. She is one that has transcended this, and not just because of her crude metrics, but the fact that she's been able to speak out against platforms. And related to that, she has also moved from being just on YouTube to having this kind of cross-platform brand. And so in this way, she's really positioned at the intersection of a bunch of practices we examine throughout the book, namely labor, creativity, and democracy. Pass it over to Thomas.
Great, thank you, Brooke. So what I want to do now is take a step back and look at the book overall. So the book has lots of these sort of personal stories, but at the same time, for us composing the book, it has been also very much sort of a balancing act, trying to bring different fields of research together and then thinking sort of comprehensively about platforms and how they intervene in cultural production. So this is the overview of the book, which David and Brooke sort of led us just through these stories. And one way to think about it is to see that platforms introduce particular institutional changes, which we can think about in terms of markets, infrastructures, governance, which you can, which are forms, you could say, of top-down governance, which is to some extent imposed on those that work with platforms. But at the same time, what we've also tried to do in the book is show how much of what we call platformization is driven by cultural producers adopting platforms, using them in their creation, distribution, marketing, and monetization tactics. So also a bottom-up process. So top-down, bottom-up, and we're really trying to make sense of that dynamic. At the center of that effort is obviously this notion of platform, and that has been around for quite a long time, and various disciplines have provided their own definition. It has also been strategically used by platform companies themselves to advertise what they're doing. But we feel that it's quite important in studying this to try to bring these different positions together and arrive at a definition that incorporates a lot of what we feel is crucial in terms of how platforms intervene in the cultural industries and also, of course, in other industries. So we understand these platforms as data infrastructures, but at the same time as markets that facilitate, aggregate, and monetize, as well as governing frameworks that govern these interactions between end users and content and service providers. So we have tried to define what a platform is, but doing so, we also immediately ran into the proliferation of this notion of platform, which you can see everywhere in the media, in academic literature, and at a certain moment, a couple of years back, it seemed that everything was turning into a platform. So we felt it was important to talk about what is not platformization, what is not a platform. So lots of companies, obviously, in the cultural industries, which we encounter, work with data, use algorithms, so the kind of characteristics which are often connected to platforms. But not all of them are platforms, right? So Netflix is a good example. Netflix uses or collects lots of data, algorithmically organizes its content, but we would not call it a platform because it is not, and this is quite important for our argument, it is not directly, economically, and infrastructurally accessible to third parties. So in layman terms, if you have a video, you can't directly upload it to Netflix, whereas in the case of YouTube, you can, right? So in that sense, that sets these types of services apart. YouTube is open for a large extent, both economically and infrastructurally, and provides such a market, a relatively open market and a relatively open infrastructure. Another term which is important in our examinations is notion of platform dependence. So the moment cultural producers start using platforms, whether they are creating content or distributing content or trying to monetize it, they become platform dependent. They start depending on the platform for doing an essential part of their business. Yet at the same time, looking at these various cultural industries, we also noticed quite early on that there are vast differences between these various cultural industries which we're interested in. So in the center of the book are the game industry, the creator industry, and the news industry. And we also talk quite a bit about the music industry. But between these industries, in all of them, we can see platforms emerging or appearing, but not all of them have historically the same relationship to platforms. So the game industry we've seen as a platform-dependent industry from the get-go, from its origins, which obviously is very much also tied to the nature of games as software that needs a platform to run on. What has changed historically, and so that's a major part of the story we're trying to tell in the book, is the type of platforms that are central to the game industry. So historically, console gaming has been important, consoles as the platform. Consoles are still important, so the PlayStation or the Xbox, but they have been joined by other types of platforms. So mobile gaming has become important, the App Store, the Apple App Store, Google Play, as well as social games, which David talked about in his opening example with Facebook as a central platform. So what we then see is different platforms appearing, which then have a huge impact on the organization of an industry, in this case, the game industry, because each type of platform requires different production, distribution, and monetization processes. So the moment you become platform dependent, things have to change in the way you develop, share, and monetize content. Then, of course, there are other industries which are historically much less platform dependent, and the obvious example is the news industry, which in a way provided two-sided markets in its own right, connecting viewers or readers with advertisers. So in that sense, the news industry has historically had a very different relationship to platforms, and you can also see that in the rhetorics about the news industry and its relationship to platforms. So there's constantly this fear, also in the academic literature, that news organizations are becoming too platform dependent, that are actually led by the metrics of platforms, that they're sort of losing editorial independence. So much journalism studies research looks into the use of metrics in media organizations. So as I said, this has been kind of a balancing act in trying to bring these different fields together, and trying to do so, we noticed, and I guess many of you are familiar with that much of the scholarship on cultural production actually takes place in what you could call silos. So subdisciplines such as game studies, creator studies, journalism studies, music studies, they run their own conferences, they have their own journals, they even have their own divisions within larger scholarly associations, and there's relatively little conversation between them. Of course, recently we have had some conferences where there was quite some exchange, but historically there was not that much conversation. Yet platformization obviously works across these fields of cultural production. So we can see the same mechanisms appearing in terms of markets and infrastructures, but also in terms of labor practices and creativity. And we can also see some of the same platforms appearing in a variety of industries. So the App Store, for example, is important for news organizations, but it is also important for game publishers. So what we really need is a comprehensive conceptual framework that allows us to understand the changes that take place across fields of cultural production, as well as that is sort of sensitive to the differences in platform dependence between these various fields of cultural production. And this then leads us to the work, the theoretical traditions or the research on platforms, where you can see a similar type of silo forming. So these are on the slide, you can see the traditions which were quite important for us: so cultural studies, media industry studies, software studies, business studies, and political economy. And they each have their own emphasis. So they each see particular aspects of a platform, and they also kind of provide their own understanding or definition of a platform, highlighting the practices of the platform or the practices developed on the platform, the infrastructures or the markets or the governance frameworks or forms of exploitation. And what we try to show in the book is that these things are not mutually exclusive. Actually, they're very much connected. So a major sort of effort on in writing this book was really thinking about these interconnections. So how do these things tie into each other? So now I'm handing over to David for a further dive into the first half of the book.
Yeah, thank you. So what I like to do is to real quick talk you through sort of the first half of the book and highlight some key concepts. And of course, if you want to, if you're interested in a specific aspect, please, please read it. Slide. So one of the first chapters talks about the question of economics, markets. And you've heard this notion before, and you may already be very familiar with it. But one of the inspirations for us was this key notion that has been around in business studies of the notion of multi-sided markets or two-sided markets. Two-sided markets are not new, multi-sided markets are not new, but this notion and scholarship on it, especially in mainstream economics, has become very popular. And there's really fantastic scholarship in economics and business studies that we as critical scholars, critical media scholars can draw on, but with a critical perspective. So what multi-sided or two-sided markets are platforms intermediate or interface between at least two sides in a market. Facebook interfaces between Zynga, the publisher, and the end users. This is a two-sided model, but they can also be three-sided, four-sided, many-sided markets. So slide. Multi-sided markets give way to an economic principle called network effects, which really help explain why networks grow so fast or also decline so fast, right? Zynga grew very fast, but then boom, once sort of the siphon or the faucet was closed, the well dried up, so to say. Network effects come in different flavors. If they happen on the same site, the more users joining, the bigger it becomes, the more value is generated, etc. So same site network effects, but they can also impact the other side of the market. The more people playing a game, the more interesting publishing games become. So growth begets growth, slide. And economists have called that winner-take-all effects. And what I always find kind of funny is that this notion stems from mainstream economics. So even mainstream economics recognizes that, hey, there's something very specific going on, is that in these networked markets, in multi-sided market, there always tends to be a really small group of winners. And we're all very familiar every day with this effect. You have Facebook, Uber, etc. In specific markets. But this, of course, has very profound effects on how we should think about cultural production that becomes platform dependent. So this is the market perspective. This brings us to the second aspect, which is this infrastructural question. And when we think about infrastructure and platforms, we should recognize that to become active on a platform, to become platform dependent, you have to integrate yourself or your company or your product or service infrastructurally. And that typically happens through APIs, SDKs, etc. So you could flip a platform and sort of open it up, the computational side. Important to recognize here is that there is an issue of centralization going on. Rather than putting your service or product on the open internet, you become subject to the logic, the infrastructural logic really of Facebook. Slide. And what that means for us scholars who are interested in the media industries is, okay, sure, you have to integrate yourself infrastructurally with a platform, okay. But how does that happen in practice, right? What do people do? And this leads us to the question, this is from information systems literature, not something I ever thought I would end up in. But again, very generative, rich literature that talks about these tools and the politics of these tools, really. So tools in platform-dependent cultural production means getting access to data, getting access to APIs, SDKs, etc. Slide. And what is important here is that platforms have this incentive to secure their boundaries. And if, as has been said by Thomas in the introduction, what makes a platform is them opening up their boundaries. And that introduces always this inherent tension for an entrepreneur or a platform company, is like, how open are your boundaries and how do you secure them? So you can, how much access to data do you give? And we saw in the Facebook Zynga example that, you know, you can go overboard in a way from Facebook's perspective. You give too much access to too much data and to the full wall of Facebook. Slide. So this brings us to this question of governance, of course, where on platforms, this question of access is really determined by these regimes of visibility and discoverability. So yes, you can get infrastructural access, but at the end of the day, it's the platform that decides on the front end and on the back end what becomes visible and invisible. And with that, I'll hand it off or back to Brooke.
Okay, so since David just provided this kind of top-down perspective on the institutional change, I want to start from the bottom and think about cultural practices, in particular cultural practices, slide, that are emerging and evolving between cultural producers on one hand, platforms on the other, related to labor, creativity, and democracy, slide. So I'll start with labor, and I'm basically going to just kind of give an example from each of these rather than spend a lot of time on each of the tensions, but they are up here. So in a lot of ways, what happens in the media and cultural industries in terms of labor is kind of seen as the vanguard of other fields of work. And so a lot of what takes place and has been taking place over the past 2 decades is kind of a testament to larger changes involving the rise of entrepreneurship, the gigification of various fields of work, insecurity, so on and so forth. And so I say this because we argue that what's happening in terms of platformization and labor isn't new, but it's an intensification of a bunch of trends we have been witnessing for decades. And so 2 in particular, I want to draw attention to: visibility and invisibility, and job security and precarity. And to do this, I'll draw upon an example of uncertainty about the algorithm, slide. So at the beginning of my discussion about Emma Chamberlain, I mentioned how she was kind of dismissive about whether the algorithm could, was something to be feared. And for any of us who use social media, when X platform updates their algorithm, that's kind of frustrating. You know, our content isn't being seen, or maybe it's out of order, but our livelihoods don't depend upon it. For content creators, their livelihoods depend upon what David mentioned earlier, these regimes of visibility. And so while Chamberlain said, you know, she doesn't really care if the platform's algorithm makes her invisible, many other content creators kind of live in angst of this. And so I have a quote up here from someone we interviewed, Cooper, a TikToker, who said that, you know, something that's worth noting is the unpredictability of the algorithm. It's not consistent. Sometimes your content goes down without notification. He said, you have no way of knowing sometimes how things work. And so this really gets to these tensions in labor. One is visibility and invisibility. Cooper is working behind the scenes, behind the screens, engaging in this kind of invisible labor in order to make content visible, hyper visible. But the reality is, you know, we don't know what exactly it takes to make that. So there's a lot of investments of time and labor in trying to make sense of the algorithm. Second is the intensification of insecurity. These fields have always been very insecure. They've been precarious, this idea you're only as good as your last job. But for content creators, not only are they worried about audience tastes and what's going to do well, now they have to think about, is this algorithm going to come in and completely uproot their entire job? So there's some tensions related to labor. In terms of creativity, I mean, creativity is one of these deeply ambivalent terms. And rather than offer a definition, what we do is think about where discourses and practices of creativity take shape. In particular, thinking about creativity as something that relates to content, creative content, including in journalism, but also creativity in terms of individual cultural producers. And once again, this introduces a series of tensions when we're thinking about, the meaning and transformations in creativity amid platformization. And so the one I want to draw attention to is qualification and quantification. Slide. So we talk in the book about the impact of a metric logic on cultural producers. And this is something that a lot of academics have engaged with. What happens when increasingly your creative process is guided by likes, favorites, comments, and so forth. And I want to be clear that, this isn't new either. Todd Gitlin in the early 80s talked about the cultural producers' reliance on ratings in an attempt to predict the unpredictable. But what is intensified and kind of been exacerbated by platform environments is the fact that these metrics are made legible by so many participants in the platform ecosystem, including advertisers, including mainstream media, and including producers and audiences who do exert some form of agency over metrics, whether we want to think about these as practices of kind of gaming the metrics or buying follows, so on and so forth. So really this continuation and exacerbation of metric logics is one of the key tensions we explore in terms of creativity. Slide. And finally, democracy. I imagine all of you are kind of well aware of this upbeat perspective that characterized early platform discourses. The idea that anyone could, have access to the tools and technologies that were formerly afforded to only traditional media industries. And to a certain extent, this is true. We have our phones that enable us to be cultural producers at the touch of a button. And that said, there's been a much more of a kind of creative, critical stance on whether access and diversity really flourish amid platformization. Slide. But platforms convince us that access and diversity are witnessing new heights. Again, the idea that all of us have access, all of us can participate in a lot of the traditional hierarchies that characterize media industries have been toppled. So is this what's happening? Well, let's take the creator economy as an example. Slide. Despite this idea that platforms encourage so many of us to create content and have this kind of meritocratic framing that if your content's good enough, the algorithm will reward you and you will generate massive audiences. The reality is it is an incredibly, to use David's term, winner-take-all ecosystem. And not only that, but a lot of the hierarchies that are in the creative economy map onto traditional markers of identity, including race, gender, sexuality, and class. And I've put a few examples up here of some efforts to really productively kind of call out platforms for these inequalities. And just to kind of bring everything back full circle, I'll again mention Emma Chamberlain, who has this kind of scrappy startup story where, the kid next door achieved massive success, but, she is white, she is cisgendered, she is American. So she's coming from a particular level or forms of privilege that don't necessarily translate into this wider ecosystem. And with that, I will return it to Thomas, who's going to wrap up.
Great, thank you. For everyone in listening, please post your questions in the chat. We would love to hear at the end what you think and what you're still puzzled by. So what I want to do now is wrap up in terms of thinking about the overall argument, because obviously trying to do so many things across various disciplines, fields of cultural production, and trying to tie these together. At the end, we were also having to decide what is actually ultimately the story that comes out of this this analysis. And this is what we came up with. So already mentioned by Brooke, an important backstory, which all of you know and all of you are familiar with these books, is obviously this idea of democratization, right? Platforms enable forms of emancipation, democratization, or the term participatory culture, ideas that were formulated in the early 2000s and for about a decade or so provided a dominant framing of thinking about platforms. And obviously that framing was very much also pushed by the platform companies themselves, who were profiting from this idea. So idea being obviously that platforms would allow individuals, individual musicians, journalists, citizen journalists, game makers, and so on, to bypass traditional gatekeepers and establish themselves as independent cultural producers, directly interacting with audiences. So this is the backstory, and that backstory well, has been criticized extensively over the past decade, and we agree with much of the critique. So we're on board with that, but at the same time, we also think it's important to try to hold on to some of these ideas. Some of these insights are still relevant, and if you've listened to our account, you can see that for many cultural producers, the fact that platforms are infrastructurally and also economically, for an important part, accessible and open, is very important to cultural producers. They do provide opportunities for cultural producers around the globe, large companies, but also individuals. So here you have the example of the Chinese video sharing platform, Kuaishou, which has been studied by two of our colleagues, Lin Jian and Jeroen de Kloet, which according to their account, allows those that are what they call unlikely creative workers, those are outside of the main centers of sort of cultural production in China, actually a way into that industry, and allow them to share their content, but also to make money through product placement, as you can see here. So for us, it's important to acknowledge that those opportunities, and to acknowledge that those opportunities are actually real. And that's important because otherwise it's very, very difficult to understand that bottom-up process of platformization, the ways in which culture producers across the board are embracing platforms to do their work, right? So there is this strong dynamic going on there. But of course, that's only part of the story. And the other part of the story is that this type of emancipation and democratization is obviously only taking place to some extent, actually to quite a limited extent. So open platforms or open platform markets and infrastructure seem to suggest a decentralization of power. But if you look at the actual dynamics, market dynamics on platforms, something David has talked about extensively, we can see network effects taking place, so winner-take-all dynamics or blockbuster dynamics, which explain the staying power of legacy media companies. So many of these industries, you can see actually the same major companies still being quite dominant. Disney is a very good example, but also the New York Times is a good example. Companies that know how to play the platform ecosystem because they have the capital, they have the brands, they have the skills in-house to be able to do so very effectively. Which doesn't mean that individual creators can't make it back big time, like Emma Chamberlain, but to sustain that success, they also need resources, talent agencies, partner programs, data tools, and so on. So we're seeing a consolidation in the media industry of some of the large players. So in that sense, a concentration of economic power in these media companies. But at the same time, we see a concentration or centralization of infrastructural and political power on the part of platform companies, who have a wide variety of what we call governing instruments to control or secure access to their infrastructures and their markets. Obviously, they do so to stimulate audience and revenue growth, right? Ultimately, what their business is about. But for creators, that means that these platforms are setting the terms under which they can create, they can share content, and they can monetize content, which obviously has huge impacts the moment things change. And that's another thing we've tried to pay attention to, or to highlight, is sort of the incessant change of these platform companies. Every so months, they're changing essential aspects of their infrastructures, and they're changing basically the access to their markets, which we've understood through this notion of platform evolution. And this evolution means, on the part of cultural producers, that they constantly have to adapt. They have to adapt their operations to the ways in which the platform is organized, which makes them particularly precarious. So this is something, I think, which we feel should receive more attention in the studies on platforms and cultural production, because it's such an important aspect of how platforms sort of affect the cultural industries. So these ways of thinking about power is what we would call institutional forms of power, the ways in which consolidation takes place in major media companies, as well as a concentration of infrastructural and economic and political power in platform companies. But doing this research and looking at these practices of labor, creativity, and democracy, we also observe that platforms are effectively creating these environments for cultural producers to work in, and to understand the ways in which these environments then shape what people do. We turn to a more Foucauldian understanding of power in the second half of the book. Understanding power as productive, as shaping the interactions between platforms and cultural producers, and basically shaping the lived reality, the everyday reality of cultural production in a platform environment. So we identified a range of power mechanisms which Brooke touched on in discussing these various tensions. And here I'm quoting from the book. We then see here power as something that produces particular worker subjectivities and responsibilities and forms of inequality and regimes of visibility and types of logics and modes of meaning making. So this is all discussed in the second half of the book, and both forms of power, the institutional form and the productive form, are profound and really shape cultural production. So to close, well, this is a sketch, although we've talked for quite a while. This is a sketch, obviously, of the overall book. In the book, we've tried to do or tried to be diverse in terms of how we talk about different regions of the world. We've tried, but not succeeded, but we've at least tried. So we do talk quite a bit about Chinese-based platform companies, and we've also took some steps in the direction of moving away from this idea of the US as being a standard trajectory of platformization, and thinking about there are multiple ways in which platformization takes place, depending on the region and basically also the sort of institutional regulatory framework in which that unfolds. And in doing so and providing this set of concept, we hope to have well developed a conceptual framework for colleagues to work with, to think about the specificity of their case, because there is a lot of variety in the field, as well as to think about the similarity of mechanisms that work across segments of the cultural industry and across geographic regions. And well, hopefully that will spark dialogue. And therefore, we really hope to hear from you and hear about the questions you have for us. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Yes, clap emoji. It's like this, isn't it? It's weird. I don't think I'll ever clap like that. Thank you. That was so interesting. I'm amazed by how much you managed to cover in the book. Like it really is like an overview of many different facets. And I think that works really well. So that was great. And I can see we've already got lots of questions coming in, but please write your questions in the chat. If anyone wants to ask them in person, then do you have the raise hand emoji thingy? Like, is that, I can't see it on mine because I'm the host, but I think you have that functionality. Anyone see it? Yeah. Yes. Okay. If you want to ask a question, then just put your hand up, and we're going to alternate. If there are people who want to ask questions in person, we're going to alternate between the text and the hand up people. And just to kick us off, I'm going to ask a couple. Hope that you will indulge me in that. So in the book, you highlight 6 key areas of study, which you've gone over today, and divided into the institutional and the platform practices. And I was really interested, I guess I'm in the mode of thinking about like how you structure a big project. I'm interested to know how you came to these categories and if you discussed using any different ones. And maybe what the book would have looked like if you had chosen different ones, or was it always going to be these 6 categories?
Shall I start? And then I think all of us would like to talk about this. This is a great question. So this was a couple of years back. So I started, we started this project, David and me, thinking about sort of the institutional side of things. I was visiting in Toronto where David works, and we were sitting down and thinking about, so what are the institutional dimensions of how platforms intervene in the cultural industries? And the first thing we did was kind of look at the literature, right? So what are these various literatures talking about, right? We were familiar with software studies, and so software studies talks about infrastructures, talks about data. So the idea of it being about data infrastructures was very sort of evident to us and immediate. And then David had been reading about or very much into business studies, which talks about it as a market. So those are quite familiar. And then obviously they didn't go that quickly, and we struggled with these terms and we went back and forth. But then we also came across, of course, the literature in political economy, in the governmentality literature, and started thinking about the ways in which platforms govern, right? So the idea of platforms as governing frameworks, and that actually looking at this more and more, realizing that those things are closely interconnected, right? That the ways in which platforms develop infrastructures actually is a form of governance. And then that actually affects how it works as a market. So all of that, I think, was very sort of, that made a lot of sense. I think we then, the subsequent step was really to open it up to practices. We were really inspired by Brooke's work. Invited her to a panel at the AOR conference a couple of years back. Maybe Brooke, you can talk about the other categories in the book.
Sure. A lot of it was thinking about, what's missing if we focus on institutional change, and what kind of gets eclipsed or elided when we're looking at the larger processes. And to me, that was, we were missing the parts about the people and the processes. And so that led us to labor and creativity, guided a lot by the literature, but also research that we had been doing. But, it's funny because you're reading a book and it looks so neatly put out, but there was a lot of like struggle behind the scenes. And one of the areas that I'm thinking about was the chapter that became democracy. We originally had it as citizenship, right? And we kept, because we knew that we wanted to put something, a key part to understanding this framework was the larger idea of who can participate and why. And so we kept citizenship, but you know, the literature on citizenship is really about users rather than producers. And so it was kind of an epiphany that what we were talking about in terms of access and diversity and truthfulness and protection from harms is not about citizens. Well, that's part of it, but it's about the workers and the people and the cultural producers. But yeah, it was a lot of struggle, and it was all friendly. We all still, I always say that we all love each other after completing a book, which I think speaks speaks to our collaboration.
Nice. David, sorry, did you want to add?
No, the only thing to add would be that in a way we do follow disciplinary fields and lines very much. So I don't think we go that much sort of off script, so to say, or we're inventing completely new fields or categories. I don't think we do that at all. But to pick up on the last thing Brooke was saying as well is what struck us is that in some ways, when we start thinking about some of these conversations like algorithms, it's so user focused, so end user focused. So we really had to make a significant effort into sometimes finding literature and in very specific questions, and sometimes not so specific questions. We were struck that there is not that much literature on certain questions when we talk about economics and, you know, the production side, the media industry side. So that's also a struggle we faced, is to, okay, we have the broad, you know, we have the chapter title and we have the broader questions, but at times we really struggle to find literature that talked about a specific issue, like with the citizenship. Yeah, it's about end users, but the question of democracy and citizenship for cultural producers is different, and sometimes there still are gaps. And we also tried to highlight those gaps, especially in the last chapter of the book.
Interesting. Yeah, I can imagine it's a challenge to write with other people, and to have 3 authors who all have, I mean, it's the strength of the book really, because you are able to bring together different siloed things, you know, that in a really strong way. But I can imagine it's complicated, right? But I think you do a good job.
Yeah, maybe just to give a little bit more, even more insight into this. So a lot of it, I mean, if you're ever going to write a book together, it's just a matter indeed of trusting each other. So I think that's really important, because otherwise, if you feel sort of harmed by others changing your text or editing your text or rewriting it, it's maybe not a good idea to enter, you know, this. So we did that all the time with each other's work, all the time. We kind of constantly revise each other's writing. So therefore, I think in the end, I'm quite happy with how it turned into one text. And the other thing which really stuck out for me, especially in this project, but it actually has been for many articles as well, is how much reviewer comments help. So we finished the book in about a year, writing the first version, and then we got like excellent reviews, which kind of made us go back to the drawing table and revise major parts of the book and develop a sort of a layer of analysis which was missing in the first version and which is there in the second version, as well as changing the last chapter from citizenship to democracy. So we really profited a lot also from just feedback from others, especially the reviewers of the publisher.
That's nice that it was a positive process experience, the reviewing, rather than painful.
Well, also painful.
Yeah. I just have one more question, and then we're going to turn, because there are lots of questions now, which is excellent. Actually, my second question ties into a couple of the questions I've seen in the text, so that's all good anyway. I just want to like zoom in on the question of like working conditions and inequalities, which you touch on. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot as well, and how these can be improved for platformized cultural producers. We've seen that attempts at collective action and regulation and these sorts of answers can be really complicated in platform contexts because of the fragmented multi-platform environments, geographical dispersion and different legal frameworks and everything like that. I'd be interested to know if you have thoughts about how we can, I guess, improve some of the less positive things that you find in the book and that other people have been discussing in the context of cultural production.
Brooke, right? This is really your question.
Yeah, I will start. And I think the term you use is absolutely apt. So you said, it's complicated. And one of the reasons thinking about improving working conditions and what one of the, I think one or two people mentioned in the questions is kind of what collective organization looks like, is because we have this sense that collective organization is the same model inherited from the 20th century where, people organized on the shop floor. And it looks very different in part because of the digitally atomized nature of work, but also because of the model of entrepreneurship where you are encouraged and prodded to kind of compete against one another in the name of your career. That said, I think, there are various forms of pushing back against platform power and advocating for more equitable working conditions. One is simply the fact that there have been a number of initiatives to make compensation more transparent, because that's one of the profound inequalities, is what brands are or aren't willing to pay creators, as well as what the platforms are willing to pay when creators in various marketplaces or partner programs and so forth. And so there's been a number of sort of grassroots, crowdsourced, anonymous sites where creators and influencers post how much they're getting paid. And so, an individual can say, well, I know that you're paying, X is the going rate for however many metrics. And so I think that's a really productive form of pushing back. And another place we're seeing it is just the collectives that are forming among these communities. Again, we tend to think of them as very competitive because it is such an overcrowded talent pool. But in a lot of cases, cultural workers are joining with others to challenge the systems of governance. And so one example we discuss in the book that draws upon work from Kelly Cotter and Victoria O'Meara is this example of pods. And I don't even know if the term is used as much anymore, but essentially when Instagram announced its algorithm change in 2016, creators were being rendered invisible. And so what do they do to challenge this when they don't really have recourse from the platform? Well, what they did is they went off platform and started these WeChat groups where they would let each other know when they posted content. Everyone would go and like their content, so it would, essentially rise up the ranks and based upon their assumptions of the algorithm. And I think assumptions is the key word there. And just finally, I'll say that more recently, I've been interviewing marginalized creators on TikTok, and there's so much speculation about how TikTok's algorithm works. And one of the things they have said they do is, when they see creators whose content they fear might be banned, and so sex workers, LGBTQ plus creators of color, they will like their content even if they don't, effectively like their content, just to enact some system of hoping that grants them visibility. So these may not look like the same forms of organization that we traditionally associated with it, but I think these are very productive ways to rally for collective support. Yeah, thanks for the question.
It's really interesting. Yeah. Sorry, did you want to add anything? Any other authors? I'm pointing, I know they're in different places for everyone, but just for me, that's where you are.
Yeah, that's always sort of disorienting, isn't it? No, I mean, I think just one thing I wanted to add is, So what we've tried to show in the book as well, and we're now actually continuing to work on this with the three of us after this book, is this idea that platformization is not necessarily an inevitable process that just continues and makes culture producers necessarily more platform dependent. Something we've been thinking about is the moment sort of negotiation that takes place, especially when sort of larger institutional actors are taking different types of decisions in terms of how they relate to platforms. So, and a good example of that, I think, is again the news industry, which of course has that history of being platform independent, and therefore has been very critical of sort of the entanglement with platforms, but as many of you probably know, has taken decisions to maybe not get as deeply on board with platforms as they initially did, right? So the New York Times famously withdrew partly from Facebook and has been quite successfully developing a subscription model to actually finance their production. And similarly, other types of news organizations have shifted away some of their resources away from platforms towards developing their own online presence and trying to reach audiences. So I think that is also important to sort of acknowledge that this is not an inevitable sort of linear process, but one that actually can take a variety of different turns.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of quite a few of the content creators I interviewed said that they had started newsletters because it was like the only non-algorithmic dependent thing they could do to connect with their audiences. I thought that was actually a really interesting distinction that they made. I think we should switch to the audience questions now because we have lots. So I'm going to hand over to Ludmilla to moderate.
Hi, thank you, Zoe. Thank you, everyone, for the great presentations. We have a lot of exciting questions. Just to repeat that people can either write down their questions in the chat and then I'm going to read it out loud. But if you want to ask them in person, you can raise your hand and then we go and you will talk on the mic. So I think I'm going to start with a couple from the chat, if that's okay. And then later we can go to the people who raised their hands. So Michael Johnston asked, is invisibility of data on technological platforms both a question of what is unseen and who sees or does not see content? That is, what content isn't observable and who doesn't see the content that is produced by users in their network? Complex question. I think we could perhaps go with another question as well, and then the authors can choose who addresses each question, if that's okay. Or you prefer to just go and answer this one?
No, go ahead and ask like 3 questions. Yeah.
So Freya McCreary asked, both content and metrics. I think she placed this question when they placed this question when Brooke was speaking, I think. Both content and metrics, for example, the newly invisible dislikes on YouTube and the new downvote response on Twitter. So I think she was probably asking about transparency and opacity of metrics, but yes, so up to you. I don't know who wants to start addressing each question.
I can start perhaps. I think it's important for us to keep, and when I say us, I mean sort of the authors, to keep the focus on cultural production. And it's so easy always to switch to, you know, how do users metrics, because, you know, we're always thinking also as end users, as consumers ourselves. And I think the perspective from producers is very different. And we're talking about a broad range of industries. And I think data visibility and data access is such a different question for a cultural producer. You know, for an individual creator, and Zoe and Brooke have talked about this and have a very different perspective on it because they literally study a different industry, right? The creator economy, social media, entertainment. But for these different industries like the game industry, data visibility and data access is such a different issue. And data transparency sounds great, but in practice, what we're seeing in the game industry, that data visibility and data access is a double-edged sword, because you get into a sort of profound economic war between acquiring users and marketing and being number one in the rankings, which is harder to do if you're an Instagram creator. You cannot, theoretically you could, but you don't see these fights of, okay, I want to be in the #1 list of Instagram or whatever. So the game industry is very different in that sense. So when we talk about data and access to data, it's, I think, important to keep in mind what kind of data are we talking about, which kind of industries are we talking about. And the last thing I'll say, it in past research I've done on Facebook and in software studies more, is that, you know, platforms are very strategic, of course, in what kind of data they give access to which industries. And that's also something to be mindful of, that we saw that with the Zynga example again, that they're, you know, end user data, sure, Zynga could access that, but then only when they tie it into Facebook's business model of advertising, and then they shut it off again.
Yeah, maybe just briefly to add to this. So I think indeed, sort of what we've done in the book is try to shift sort of the focus from end users to cultural producers, something which took some sort of discipline on our part. And I think that sort of, yeah, opened up some well, ways of thinking about this. But I think one thing which is important for both end users and culture producers is just realizing on these major platforms how much content there is being shared, right? So the moment we say that certain things are invisible doesn't necessarily mean that they're not at all accessible, right? The content is actually there, but it's just not becoming visible, right? So it's not made visible. And I think for many of these platforms, the struggle is really from the part of culture produced to attain visibility through a variety of these strategies. And that's complicated. So that's not something that can be accomplished with just a couple of sort of easy tricks. That requires sort of discipline and sort of ongoing efforts, data analysis, and as well as capital investments. So, and I think, so that is, I think, quite important to realize when thinking about this on platforms. Visibility is not an absolute thing, like we used to think about it in terms of mass media. Things are published or not published. Much is published, but much of it is published, but not really visible.
Should we move on to the following questions then? Okay, so just to take one more from the chat.
I think Brooke, maybe you want to talk about the
the second one, yeah.
Yeah.
The one about the metrics, yeah.
Yeah, just to chime in and bringing together this idea from within the creator economy, this idea of metrics with visibility. I mean, a lot of it is unknown. You know, and this is a lot when the visibility of metrics are not known or not confirmed, that really fuels a lot of speculation. And so is my content not getting seen and not generating metrics because of it's not good content, or more likely because there is some invisible hand, namely the algorithm, playing a role? And so that's where, you know, we kind of come back to, from creative practices to the larger infrastructural framing, because, you know, is this based on content moderation? Is this based on these policies exhibited by the platform, and how do you make sense of them? How do you negotiate them? And, you know, it's interesting to see that an entire cottage industry is kind of springing up around metrics. And, you know, you can pay for a consultant, you can buy likes, you can engage in other practices that platforms consider gaming the algorithm. And so this is how kind of within this particular industry, it reorganizes the emphasis on metrics in all the surrounding contexts.
Thank you. So in the chat, we had a question that really resonated with what Zoe previously asked, which was about what would you see as an effective forms of labor organizing, such as strike action, cooperativism, and that are well suited to the dynamics of cultural labor on platforms. And then Brendan Harris asked a question, but then also raised his hand. So I wonder if he wants to ask his question in person.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's such an awkward dynamic. So I don't know what to do, but I was just curious because you talk so much about these platform companies and how they have basically, you know, a monopoly on governance. And so I'm just curious how you think about like who you are talking about. And so when we're talking about Meta, they have clearly shown that most of those decisions are made by Zuckerberg or his C-suite of employees. And so they kind of ignore most of the other thousands of employees there. And so I'm just curious if you have any advice for researchers who are kind of struggling against that dynamic. I mean, because obviously try to talk to the employees, but you know, many of them have NDAs as well. So I'm just curious for research, you know, like how can we kind of penetrate that black box, even though we can make meaningful work such as yours without it?
Yeah, I can take this one. Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, you know, this is, I love this question, like the methods question. In a way, you know, there's good scholarship on emerging scholarship on companies like Amazon and Facebook, and you know, they talk around it. And it, you know, as you're saying, it's hard to get access to those companies. Yes. Then if we look at the history of television and film studies, there's good work there that we want to be mindful of, like media industry studies. And then there are colleagues that have in the past gotten access to companies that we might imagine in the past were really hard to access, like Hollywood studios, etc. And I find that they show that it can be done. It's incredibly hard. You know, it's one of those PhD projects that you have to dedicate your life to you know, getting access to Mark Zuckerberg. Well, good luck. But in a way, you know, that could be a PhD project, and it's hard, but the history of our field has shown that it can be done. What we have done, and what I've done personally in terms of methods, is most of these companies are public companies, and they have a fiduciary duty to be transparent to their investors. So, you know, Zuckerberg is talking a bunch, and there's, you know, also great scholarship on sort of unpacking that, what he's trying to say, and all this discursive, you know, BS. But you know, actions speak louder than words. If you really dig into the quarterly filings, the quarterly calls, you go to these developer conferences, F8, Facebook conferences. So these, for us, I think, especially in media industry studies, production studies, going to these conferences, there you really can talk to people who work at Facebook. And in my past research on app economies, digital advertising technology companies, you can get surprisingly close by going to developer conferences, reading quarterly filings and calls. So there is a very sizable amount of data out there. We just have to accept and recognize that we'll never get access to Zuckerberg. But, you know, is that a bad thing? If you talk to those C-suite guys, I've done it a couple of times in the game industry. They're so unscripted, they will never tell you anything you don't know.
Maybe you can add something to this. So this is very typical, actually, the way we are answering these questions is the way we've written this book. So often in conversation with each other, like, oh, you know, this is what I think, and then we're adding something to this. So one thing I think conceptually, which is important though, to think about in terms of when you say, oh, Meta, you know, and sort of the power decisions they take. Yes, that's certainly an important part of the story. But what we've also tried to show is that thinking about power in relation to platforms, whether it's in the cultural industry or other industries, to gain a better sense of how that works, it is important to move away from this idea of those platform companies holding sort of power well, alone, right, in isolation, and being omnipotent. I think that is a sort of a misunderstanding of how these power relations work. in many ways, they actually are exercised through mutual dependence. They only work because many people are dependent on these platforms. And the moment they move away, platforms tend to adapt, right? So the moment advertisers are no longer happy with the way YouTube is running its advertising system and are boycotting the platform, YouTube changes its terms of service. So those kinds of dynamics are ongoing. So in that sense, governance is something that is actually negotiated between a variety of different actors. And it's those kind of negotiations you need to also investigate to understand how power works. So not just focusing on Mark Zuckerberg or any of these other major CEOs, but also looking into these sort of processes of negotiation.
And I will add the Brooke/labor angle in response to Brandon's question, because yeah, I think we all get excited with methods questions. And this goes back to visibility and invisibility. I mean, who are the most visible actors? Of course, it is the C-suite groups, but these industries or these companies are sprawling, and they have so many different workers, including a lot of contract workers. And you know, there are different elements of NDAs and so forth, but I did a project last summer where we were interviewing search quality raters who worked for Google, and we recruited them on a Reddit forum for gig workers, because, you know, these individuals, I mean, there are in Silicon Valley, but all over the world, these companies are employing a lot of workers who are invisible to us, but are making a lot of decisions that end up shaping how these companies work, and in particular, you know, content moderation decisions, or in the case of search quality raters, what you know, what is rendered more or less visible in a Google search. So I think that's a productive angle. And I really liked David's comment about, you know, if we could interview the top executives, which I think many of us are unlikely, are we going to get the sort of good material or inside scoop? And my colleague Catherine Sender has this notion of the pitch. And this is from, you know, a book that came out maybe 15 years ago, but she was interviewing media and marketing producers and found that their interactions are always structured through this pitch. So, you know, how do we get beyond that if we're talking to people, essentially, if they have this marketing orientation? Are we able to really get insight in the same way we would if we were looking at different levels within an organization?
Great. Should we move on to the next questions then? So in the chat, Maria O'Brien asked, where do you see law as a field of study fitting in, and particularly the new emerging field of law and political economy, which is finding really useful as a way of thinking about competition law and regulation of platforms? And then Michela Ornati mentioned that fashion is considered now a cultural industry in Europe, and there is an emerging phenomena of young fashion designers creating digital outfits, specifically for gaming platforms or digital environments. And so she asked whether you have come across this, especially because the notorious labor issues of the fashion industry are probably shifting onto new digital environments as well. So two very different questions.
Very different. Can I ask the law? Can I answer the law one? So yeah, I mean, so we're not legal scholars. We're not. So in that sense, this is not our field. Although we do collaborate with colleagues in the law faculty, and this is something we've sort of struggled with in writing the book, which is difficult for us. So one important moment for me in writing this book was, well, as I said, the reviews were great. And one of the things the reviews pointed out, which was sort of this eye-opening moment, is that what we've done really well, and I'll get to the law question through this anecdote. So what we've done really well in the book, in the first version of the book, is describe how platforms work as markets, infrastructures, and governance frameworks, as well as how labor practices and creativity and democracy processes unfold. Yet so in that sense, we've really studied the internal process well, but what we haven't done very well, at least in the first version, was to understand how platforms work with sort of in these broader contexts, in broader market relations, because obviously these platforms as companies also compete with other companies. They are sort of embedded in other infrastructures, often public infrastructures, and they are embedded within particular legal systems, right? So they are, and of course they are sort of in longer histories of economic development and so on. So that layer of analysis was kind of missing. And what we've done in rewriting the book, which took us about 8 months, is bring in that layer sort of in every chapter. And then in the governance chapter, what was kind of the effort we had to make was to consider what kind of impact do these various sort of regulatory traditions have on the ways in which platforms can operate. And precisely at that moment, I think we were confronted with this question of diversity. So the moment you start looking at this only from the perspective of US platforms, you get a very particular sort of thinking about regulation and law, which is very much about freedom of expression and copyright. But the moment you start looking at other parts of the world, especially China is a good example, then you start thinking about this relationship between platform companies and sort of legal frameworks quite differently. And that's kind of what we've tried to do, to show, well, you know, in other legal systems, this actually works quite fundamentally differently. And in the Chinese framework, platforms are considered as media companies, so taking quite a different position. So that's, I think, the way we've tackled that question. But obviously, we're no legal experts, and more work can be done. But to think about this, I think around the world in terms of diversity is I think an important aspect to studying this.
I can take the second question because I love it. That's great. The fashion question. So we don't talk about fashion that much in the book. We talk about, I think fashion blogging comes up, but fashion as an industry, not so much. And I think I don't want to speak too much for my co-authors, but it's also not our main expertise, I think. But the question of if fashion design becomes platform dependent, especially in gaming and virtual gaming platforms and virtual environments, you know, you could easily see that happen, Minecraft, but also everything Meta is doing with their whole metaverse stuff. In a way, we do talk about it indirectly, but when we talk about modding and modifications, and anybody who knows about the history of the game industry knows that a decade or 2 decades ago, there was this phenomenon called modifications, where amateur developers started making their own little games and designs, and it was very similar to what this is talking about. It was also literally architecture, making new buildings, and also fashion. And what we can take away from that history is that the dynamics we discussed for virtually every other mode of production that is very individualized, we'll see those economic, infrastructural, and governance dimensions and issues and mechanisms probably play out when fashion designers become subject to, let's say, Microsoft and Minecraft, or Meta and the metaverse, Facebook's virtual world. So all the questions you will be asking about labor, about creativity, there are probably going to be very similar, many similarities, but then, you know, we would also be saying, oh, please write that up, because it would be another piece of the puzzle for us in a way as a case study, because there will also be interesting differences, right? And there it's where it gets so interesting. In which region? Is it Europe? Is it another part of the world? And et cetera, et cetera. So there will be striking differences there as well that we'll be like, oh, I already look forward to reading that, because it's something I don't know anything about.
Thank you, David.
Okay, so the next questions, they're actually about end users, and you mentioned a few times how the book is mostly focused on cultural production itself, but I wonder if you'd like to address those. So José Moreno asked, in the context of the power struggle between platforms and end users, do you think current regulation trends imputing moderation efforts on platforms could empower them even more in detriment of end users? And then Virginia Crisp wonders to what extent the discussion has considered circulation of content, ideas, and voices. From what you say, seems intertwined with your discussion of production. And she said she imagines that the books go into more detail, but she would love to hear more about your take on the implication of platformization on media distribution. So if you have anything to add on those topics, please feel free to talk.
I can start with a few words on the question about circulation and distribution, because you know, it kind of maps onto transformations into how media industries have been studied, and in particular thinking about how the evolution and platformization has kind of supplanted some of the activities from content production to content promotion. And I think this even ties to the question about fashion and games. There's this kind of romantic notion that if you work in media, or if you work in the culture industries, you are essentially having your creative ideas that are circulating in your head and you are putting them out there. It's a creative process. But what I found in interviews is the content promotion, and essentially this is distribution across the platform ecosystem, occupies an increasing mental space and kind of timing space where, sure, you may be putting your ideas out there, but it's a lot of time, energy, and labor to circulate them in different contexts, especially as we are moving further into this multi-platform environment. Here I would kind of plug Zoe's forthcoming IJOC piece, forthcoming for a while, as we know how academic.
Forthcoming.
Yeah, still forthcoming. But essentially challenging this idea that, you know, production is the critical part of platformization. I think promotion and distribution are essential to that. So that's how I would get at that question, but I'm curious how Thomas and David would.
Yeah, I can take a stab at this as well. What we tried to do is to pull these parts of the process apart and to talk about creation, distribution, marketing, and monetization. And in practice, we are very aware that some of these parts overlap and you cannot untangle them, but in certain industries, they are somewhat distinct. And we've really made an effort to see if we can pull them apart, because in some industries, some part of the creation process is platform independent, distribution is platform dependent, and then marketing is platform independent again. When you start thinking about it like that, you get, you know, it helps to make analytical sense of different industries, different platforms, etc. So we've been very mindful of that. Some, like in the game industry, some game modes of game development are fully intertwined. Everything is, you know, happening at the same time. But in the traditional form of blockbuster console production, it's much more pulled apart. And then again, you see, you know, you can make interesting analytical observations about those differences.
Yeah, maybe just very briefly to add to this. So I think for us, it really was very helpful. And I just want to second David there. It was really helpful to draw apart this process, right? So thinking about creation, distribution, monetization, marketing, because ultimately what we then call platformization is just not one thing. It falls apart in a variety of sort of maybe these particular mechanisms, which might not all work in the same way, right? So maybe we can call, and here we're getting sort of in the nitty gritty of our book, maybe some culture producers are very platform dependent in terms of their distribution and monetization, which we actually see in many of these markets, yet they are very platform independent in creation. And then these things are also changing over time. So this is not fixed, right? So this is subject to shifts in strategies, as well as on what's happening on platforms, as well as what cultural producers decide to develop as a strategy. So thanks, a great question.
Great. So we have one question left from the chat and then one raised hand. I'll just read it out loud, the question by Evian Leydig. She asked, within platform governance, we know that there are many stakeholders involved within this ecosystem, not least states. Does the book cover state-corporate relations in platform governance in different parts of the world, such as China or India? In particular, are states concerned with cultural production as it reflects narratives of digital nationalism? And then Valeria, if you want to open your mic and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry because I am with the iPad and so writing is a bit complicated, so rather talk straight away. So my question, I certainly it was mentioned in the presentation, but I'd like to have a little bit more of your outtakes on the advertising side of the platforms. I think that the advertisers, that has also changed a lot. I get a lot about the creators, the labor, but ultimately also I see the advertiser world has been transformed by that. Some more modest actors are launching campaigns like the neighborhood yoga studio that wouldn't have thought about it 20 years ago. And so in some sort, they become also part of this invisible machine, and also other than the big advertisers from Unilever or others that will eventually push the change from model or that can audit the algorithms more deeply. But so all these forces that are impacting from the advertising side. So how are they? How have you seen what have you seen in your reflections about it? How is that manifested right now? How is that about to change? Is it, or it's considered like in a marginalized aspect of platforms, as in advertising as a newspaper industry, for example, that it could be thought? So, and thank you very much for the presentation and for the organizers. It's been very, very interesting and thought-provoking also for this.
Shall I start with the first question? So by the way, great questions, everyone, really nice and happy, you know, how you engage with what we've done. So really, really nice to talk to you. So concerning the relationship with governments, yes, that's certainly been quite central to our thinking about this. Sort of that ties in with the way I talked about before, about sort of thinking about the regulatory frameworks in which these platform companies operate in different parts of the world. And so here, I also have to say, and that applies actually to many of the things we discuss in the book. Again, this is not something we have done primary research on ourselves. So we've only been able to write this book because many of our colleagues have been doing just great research that allows us to actually talk about this. And so this applies certainly to thinking about the ways in which states relate to platforms, which at least in writing this book for us, mostly drew our focus to China and the ways in which the Chinese state is approaching platforms very much as media companies. So holding them accountable for things that are shared. And that means that media companies or platforms as media companies have to consider basically before content is being shared, what is actually can be shared in this particular context. So that's quite a different relationship to the state and what we're familiar with, at least in the US context. Having said so, I think this is an area in which in different parts of the world, not just China, but India is another good example. But I would say also Australia, and to some extent also Europe, that we're seeing very important shifts taking place. And that more and more so states are becoming concerned, obviously also by sort of what has been called the disinformation or fake news crisis, are becoming concerned about what is being shared and feel that it's their responsibility, and ultimately, of course, the responsibility of platform companies to moderate this. So I think this is a debate that has started, and good research is being done, but that will require much more research in the years to come, because it's going to be an ongoing battlefield.
I can take the digital effort, or start an answer of the digital advertising question. So thanks, Valeria, for asking that question. Because we're dealing with companies that are at the heart of the digital advertising ecosystem, at least in countries mostly outside of China. Facebook and Google, of course, are, they have a majority share of the digital advertising revenue pie. So they have a massive incentive to really instill this logic of everything you do as a cultural producer on these platforms, you should use our own tools to become more visible. And if we, for me, I instinctively go back to the game industry, because there you have this new mode of game production, free-to-play games, free games, freemium games. And in my book, or my understanding, they have been really at the forefront of using digital advertising to make a free game, and then to identify their audience, and then to heavily start advertising against it, or to really do audience targeting. And there we have seen that by virtue of doing so, that industry, free-to-play games, have become fully platform dependent for their advertising. Right? The whole loop of playing a game, acquiring a game, getting good at it, buying, berries or whatever, Smurfs, or doing something completely random in a game, becomes seemingly random, but then for these game developers, they can see all that and heavily advertise against it. So they can target specific user groups with the help of Facebook and Google. So to me, I've always said, and my colleagues have said in game studies, free-to-play games are the canary in the coal mine in that sense. And I think we're seeing similar logics now in other industries, journalism and creators, that they're sort of slowly following that logic. So if it's up to Facebook and Google, they would always say, if you want to be visible, you want to use our platforms for everything you do. And if they're going to follow that game industry route, that would deeply worry me, because what we've seen there, it's also very much a race to the bottom. Right? Only companies that are incredibly well capitalized will, and we see that in the game industry today, can acquire specific users, because acquiring specific users generates more money. So you get this winner takes all logic, but then not in just generating revenue, but also generating attention. And we don't see that yet from what I'm segueing to Brooke now. I don't think we see this in the creator economy yet, where individual creators are advertising and acquiring users, but I may be wrong here. But the moment we start that, where individual creators or groups of creators start targeting campaigns using digital advertising targeting tools, from an economic perspective, it will not end well for those, for that part of the industry, for that reason, that winner take all logic. Brooke, what do you think?
I think there's two concurrent trends we can think about in terms of advertising that really relate to creative practice. One is, of course, you just mentioned creators, but the fact that there is a huge market for, organic advertising. And we've been hearing this for like 2 decades, that, people see 3,000 messages a day. And so how do advertisers get their message across? Well, you integrate it into the content. And so, in the 80s and 90s, this was like product placement. And so now it's very much orchestrating campaigns through influencers and content creators. And there are so many different genres of influencers. I just saw within the past week, there was an article on TikTok doctors and another one on agriculture influencers. And, this is really about sharing ideas, but this is essentially, if you're an advertiser, well, how do I get my, one of the scary things is like, how do I get my drug to this particular doctor who can peddle it? And I'm not saying this is happening, but this is kind of the concerns that get raised in this. But the other kind of concurrent trend layered upon this is the momentum towards nicheification. This also has a long history. It started in the 70s and 80s where, magazines were becoming focused on niches rather than masses. But now, because there are so many different creative genres, these all provide opportunities for advertising within, like the term is taste communities. And so, we draw on Jessica Maddox's work on ASMR videos, the tingle videos, and thinking about, well, what types of people are watching these, and how could this be a good market for meditation apps or whatever it may be. So I think, whatever these new genres and content creative practices that are happening, I mean, this is a place where advertisers, of course, want to be, and whether, but of course they have to balance that with the consumer end users' need for content that isn't heavily advertised. So it's a balance.
Thank you very much. I just cannot avoid thinking. I'm a PhD researcher on metrics, digital metrics, and on communication professionals and PR. And I really feel that the metrics is the backbone of the thing, because as opposed of creators trying to understand the algorithm and see like getting more numbers, is just the same platforms trying to show higher numbers to the advertisers and to justify and say, yes, you get 20,000 prints, and so this is so good, you can continue investing. And the trust from the advertiser side to these platforms is very much in question due to all these shady algorithms instead. Again, so thank you very much for your answers. Very clarifying. I'm looking forward for reading the book.
Right. I think that we've reached the end of our questions. That was a very nice timing. So well done, everyone, for asking the right number of questions. We didn't even go right up to the line. So I think 2 hours is perfect. I just want to say thank you so much to Thomas, David, and Brooke for coming and sharing their research. It's been a really lovely event. And thank you to everyone for asking interesting questions and questions that actually push the conversation outside of the presentation. That's really nice. And thank you so much to Ludmilla for moderating the Q&A. And that's it. I guess we're at the end, but we've recorded the session and I'm going to send it out on various email lists tomorrow or today. So, for people who couldn't come, and even if you want to rewatch it, who knows? So just everyone give a little round of applause, and I hope you have a nice afternoon. Is it the weekend yet? Have a nice weekend. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for hosting this. This was wonderful. I really loved all your questions, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation and the thought-provoking questions.
Okay, cool. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.